quantum social change and you matter that more than you think has been an inquiry, an ongoing inquiry of asking questions about like what is that nature of change in the context of global change. And I'm going to be showing you a lot of artwork today, and that's this project has been a collaboration with Norwegian artist Tone Bjørdam, and that was during COVID. So we had a really, it's different ways of expressing very similar things. But I just want to start, as Anna did this morning, with where we're at. And we know that like we are really on the brink. Scientists are telling us that we're on the brink of 5 disastrous climate tipping points. And we feel that sense of like a crisis all over the world. And it's not just climate change, it's biodiversity loss. Now it's wars, it's political crises, etc. And what we're recognizing is, and this kind of hit home literally with Hurricane Milton, is that we are transforming large-scale global systems. We are influencing them, and that we are actually having a role, and they will transform us. So how do we consciously and deliberately transform systems so that all life can thrive? And many of you are probably familiar with the doomsday clock that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists put out every year. And 2 years ago, this is it represents how close we are to destroying our world with dangerous technologies. And for the last 20 years or so, they've included climate change in that. And they move the clock hand towards midnight every year. And when I was born in the 60s, it was about 12 minutes to midnight. And when I started studying climate change in the late 80s, it was about 6 minutes to midnight. And here we know that, we're about, this was in 2022, it said, without swift and focused attention, truly catastrophic events that could end civilization as we know it are more likely. When the clock stands at 100 seconds to midnight, we are all threatened. The moment is both perilous and unsustainable, and the time to act is now. And this is very much aligned with the United Nations, which is calling, this the decade for action. And I want to argue today that we actually have to talk about it, the decade that matters. And in the years since, with the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, the clock has moved up to 90 seconds to midnight. So in my research, I'm really curious and asking myself, like, how do we transform at the rate, scale, speed, and depth that is called for to successfully respond to these multiple crises? The question isn't whether we can, but it's really how can we do this? Because I feel that there's like no option, but we must, we really need to think about the how. And how do we do this in an ethical, equitable, and sustainable manner, rather than applying the same ways of doing things that have been shown not to work? And in relation to the work you're all doing, how do we strategically design for systems change? And I think that's a really key point in this. And coming up in all of this is this question of like, gosh, what's my role in this? Do I matter? And I think I felt that during the hurricane, that how insignificant we sometimes feel when faced with these large-scale systems change. And I want to argue that we are much more significant than we think. And to understand this, we have to really rethink the relationship between individual change, collective change, and systems change. And my entry point for this, this work and inquiry is the question is, are we underestimating our individual and collective capacity for social change? And obviously, I think we are, because we're really taking it as a very like a very limited perspective on the relationships between humans and nature and humans and each other. And we're still actually applying our approach to change in a very mechanistic way. And we'll talk about leverage points, but we're really kind of thinking like, okay, we have to fix this problem in the same way that, like with mechanical force. And this is addressing not just climate change, but all the so-called planetary boundaries, but also the social foundations in terms of gender equality, health, food, water, income, education, resilience, voice, jobs, energy, and not the least, social equity. So how do we actually work with leveraging change in this real world, but also recognize that there's other ways to approach social change? And this has been part of my research in a project called Adaptation Connects, which is on combining old and new knowledge to enable conscious transformations to sustainability. And very kind of similar to Fred's talk, you're talking about like flexibility, empowerment, collaboration, and creativity. And I think that reflexivity and reciprocity fall in there as well. And through the different projects, we really try to look at not just how do we adapt to these changes, but how do we adapt to the very idea that we are transforming systems at these large scales. And in this way, it's really adaptation as transformation. And for me, that becomes really the most important thing, that it's a real switch in our thinking here. And when I think about transformation, I think about them as physical and or qualitative changes in form, structure, and meaning making. Not just one thing, but as the caterpillar metamorphosizes into a butterfly, it changes its form, it changes its structure, and it changes its meaning making altogether. However, I think there's also a deeper dimension of transformation. And Monica Sharma, who I collaborate with, she's the author of Radical Transformational Leadership. And I've been working with her conscious full spectrum response for the last 15 years. She talks about transformation as the powerful unleashing of human potential to commit, care, and affect change for a better life. So in other words, transformation isn't just something out there that we do in the world, but it's something like that is driven within us and very developmental. And so working with her conscious full spectrum response within the field of climate change and global change in general, we transformed this into the three spheres, or translated it into the three spheres of transformation. And I want to walk you through that and then get to that outer sphere and when we talk about paradigms and why they are so important. But I just want to point out that often, we're looking at these as the practical, the political, and the personal changes in form, structure, and meaning making, all being part of the transformation process. But very often, when people are talking about energy transitions and sustainability transitions and transformations, they're very focused in the practical sphere. They're focusing on the behaviors and the technical responses that we can measure. And these are, captured in the 169 targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in our attention to, for example, solar panels or, bike lanes or, all the things that we actually need to have. And we tend to be very, good at these technologies and good at these types of solutions, but we're still not moving any needles. In fact, the rate of change is actually going up in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the loss of wildlife and species, et cetera. And that's often, and this is where you all come in, that we forget about the political sphere, the systems and the structures, the social and cultural norms, rules, regulations, and institutions that actually influence how we are together. How do we organize ourselves as human beings? And it's in this political sphere that we get power, that we get vested interests, that we get this that it takes us decades to get to a voluntary agreement on climate change. And it's also here where we get the social movements, we get the, people are actually launching the alternatives from this space in the political sphere. So it's really important. And as systems designers, this is what we really want to change to have an impact on the practical sphere. But again, this is where polarization and paralysis, we tend to be stuck here in the political sphere, and it seems almost impossible to get out of. And that's often because we're forgetting about the personal sphere. And the personal sphere refers to the beliefs, the values, the worldviews, and the paradigms that not just of individuals, but of collectives, our shared views. And these influence how we see the system, how we see our role in the system. What type of outcomes do we want in that practical sphere? What are we going to prioritize, et cetera? So the idea is that often, especially in academia, that we tend to be focusing on all of these things as very separate. Like, I work in the political sphere, I work in the personal sphere, I work in the practical sphere. But what we need is to really understand that outcomes for sustainability involve simultaneously influencing or an awareness of all three of these spheres. And this brings me then to the leverage points of Donella Meadows, which you're all familiar with from, in places to intervene in a system, her foundational paper. And when we look at the practical sphere, they kind of map quite well onto the very low leverage points, the constants, the parameters, the numbers, buffers, trying to really change things there. And they ignore a lot of the system's dimensions, the feedback loops, the flows, the information flows, the rules of the system, etc. And I would argue then that the personal sphere really maps onto the higher level things, like what are the goal of the system and what is the mindset or paradigm through which the system arises, and can we actually transcend those paradigms? And because we're in such a crisis, because we are in the decade that matters, then I really feel that we should be working at these highest leverage points for systems change. And that goes into like, how are we designing, what is the role of ourselves as the ones who are engaging with systems change? So I'm going to just focus now on paradigms, because as we know that paradigms are so important, because as a set of concepts and metaphors and patterns of thought, that they really are what the source, what Donella Meadows says, they are the sources of systems. From them, from shared social agreements about the nature of reality, come systems goals and information flows, feedback, stocks, flows, and everything else about systems. So if we want to change systems, I think thinking about how to shift paradigms is really important. And this is where I think most of our, like how we relate to each other, how we relate to nature, how we relate to the future, a lot of that is based on a paradigm still in the Western world, predominantly, that sees us as separate from each other, that sees us as separate from nature, and sees us as inherently, very much, like what Isaac Newton referred to as like solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles. We are just these individuals that clash together. And what this means then is, like it's very much kind of from this Enlightenment worldview, mechanistic, atomistic, deterministic, reductionist, and materialist view. And we're trying to change the system from that perspective. And what this actually means is that we are drawing a line between me and you and us and others, between society and the environment, and also between humans and nature, and then trying to fix it from that perspective as if we are separate. And quantum physics, with its, I'm not going to go into a lecture on quantum physics, but the idea that of both the simultaneity of both waves and particles, or superposition, or the observation that measurements influence the outcomes, the observer and the objects aren't separate, and quantum tunneling and backward causation. There's a lot of phenomenal things that at the scale of subatomic particles is really important. But I want to point out that these ideas, are also metaphorically, methodologically, and meaningfully significant at the social scale. And our current paradigm has led to fragmentation. It's led to this almost like house of mirrors, where we're just bumping into each other and not actually having the impact and getting the results we want to see in the world. And I think that's it's quite alarming when we think about that. And David Bohm, back in 1980, was aware of this in Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And he said, what is primarily needed is a growing realization of the extremely great danger of going on with a fragmentary process of thought. And I think that that's where systems thinking comes in, that we're trying to see complexity in the dynamics of these systems, and like why we need to focus on that political sphere of, how do we actually organize society? And again, the idea that reality is not as it seems has been like grounded in physical science. And I want to acknowledge that indigenous wisdom traditions, indigenous knowledge and wisdom traditions have been saying these things for a long time, but science itself is telling us that reality isn't what it seems, and we don't understand how to interpret that and what it means for our philosophically and practically for our big world, for our larger macro world. So quantum mechanics forced physicists to reshape their ideas of reality, to rethink the nature of things at the deepest level, and to revise their concepts of position and speed and their notions of cause and effect. And to me, this is really important because this is, and as I'll get into, this has implications for how we think of ourselves in the world. And quantum biology is an emerging field where it recognizes that this boundary between the quantum and the classical worlds is actually blurry and increasingly questioned. These authors say that quantum mechanics is normal and it's the world that it describes that is weird. And author physicist Donna Zohar has gone so far as to say that we actually live in a quantum world, and once we fully grasp that, nothing will ever be the same again. So really getting it that the classical world is the exceptional world that we see rather than the quantum is important. And this has been taken up in the social sciences, and this is where what got my interest and enthusiasm for this, because like international relations theorist Alexander Wendt, who came up with, really was pioneered constructivism in international relations. He started to question his own paradigm, and he said, if human beings really are quantum, then maybe classical social science is essentially founded on a mistake, and social life will therefore require a quantum framework for its proper understanding. So he really made a quantum leap in his work and started to challenge our basic understandings of social sciences, which have very much in the positivist social sciences have been based on a very Newtonian mechanistic type of approach to thinking about the rational reductionist approach. And idealism a lot of the environmental humanities and social sciences have been relegated to the backwaters. And I see this in intergovernmental assessments and everything, that we prioritized a certain way of making sense of the world. And physicist and feminist Karen Barad has gone further, and in her work on agential realism and meeting the universe halfway, quantum physics and the entanglement of matter and meaning, she points to the key lesson from quantum physics is that we are part of the nature that we're trying to understand. And she says matter is not a thing, but a doing, a congealing of agency through which phenomena come to matter. And this, I think, is really important because, she's basically saying, and she, to quote her, says, it matters to the world how the world comes to matter. And so this means that we need to dig deeper and look into this. And for me, working on climate change for 35 years, I think, what are we missing? And can insights from quantum physics and quantum social science inspire transformations that are not just rapid and effective, but also equitable, ethical, and sustainable? And so to me, this inquiry is really important because, to look back from 100 years from now, people will say, what were they missing? What didn't they see that was right in front of their eyes? And I think, from in all systems thinking, it's we didn't see that we were connected. We didn't see that we were, entangled, and that the answers were right there. And so You Matter More Than You Think really was an experimental project in writing in many ways, and again in collaboration with Tony Bjordam with the artwork. And I can talk about the experimentality of it afterwards, but in it I define quantum social change as a conscious, nonlinear, and non-local approach to transformations that is grounded in our inherent oneness. So it's really, it recognizes that we are entangled through language, through meaning, through shared context, and also that our deepest values and what we deeply care about and our intentions are potential sources of individual change, collective change, and systems change. So I'm going to just walk you through some of the chapters and ideas, and just quite briefly to without giving the whole narrative, but I just want to show you that how different elements come together to really shift the way we see ourselves in relation to systems. And the first part is that beliefs matter. They influence the perspectives that we take on the relationship between self and society and self and system, including what we believe to be physically possible. If we believe it's impossible to transform anything, then that's going to be a very self-fulfilling prophecy. And so we can have these conscious or subconscious beliefs, but they're always affecting how we are, how we show up in the world. And many of the debates that are going on right now reflect these beliefs about either or, right, wrong, us, them, and kind of the very binary things. And quantum physics is challenging that idea of separateness, the idea of fragmentation. And one, there are many interpretations of quantum physics, but one that actually focuses on beliefs is quantum Bayesianism or cubism, which draws on this idea of participatory realism. Or that the personal beliefs that individuals hold about anything play a role in shaping our reality. So in other words, from cubism's perspective, quantum theory is about agency, it's about actions, it's about consequences, and it's about the expectations that we have about the world. So, if our beliefs influence the world, then what do we believe about ourselves in relation to systems? And can we actually not just look through our beliefs as blindly and transparently, but look at our beliefs and question some of those beliefs? And that brings us into relationships. And systems, I think, are just relationships between parts to form a larger whole. And relationships matter because they really influence our idea. They reflect our ideas of self, other, and nature. And as I said before, they've been influenced by these Enlightenment worldviews of, very classical individualism, determinism, etc. And so if we think of systems as quantum systems characterized by entanglement, uncertainty, superpositions, etc., then we start to see that we're not just interacting as separate parts, but we're interacting as Karen Barad writes, as part of a larger whole. And so when we change our relationship to the system itself changes. And I think this is not new knowledge, but it really comes, drawing awareness to the relationships between wholes and parts, and the I and we and the both and relationships is critical if we actually want to shift the system. So overcoming the dualisms as an inherent part of the system is part of systems change. And here then we get to, I talk about metaphors mattering and other things that I've left out, but entanglement is, I think, the essence of quantum social change, because in everyday language we use entanglement to mean that we're like twisted together or entwined. But in a quantum system, it actually has a very specific meaning. It goes beyond the metaphors, and it means that information about separate particles is revealed when a measurement is made on one of them, even if no information passes between them. So it's not spooky action at a distance, but it's a correlation. So it's a connection and a correlation. And Alexander Wendt, in his work, when he talks about like quantum social theory and quantum social science, he's talking about us being entangled through language and entangled through meaning, that it is the shared meaning that we collapse a wave of possible meanings into a shared understanding. And so I think this is really important in terms of, not just the language that we're using, but also the stories that we're telling each other. And in my work for years, I've been using Q methodology, and I didn't realize that that was actually reflecting this quantum world of potential of different meanings, everything. So entanglement matters a lot. And this brings in the question of consciousness. And Alexander Wendt, really focuses on quantum brain theory and quantum consciousness and everything. But I think in terms of climate change and global challenges, that we actually have to acknowledge that consciousness matters. That, if we want to actually deliberately transform at this rate and scale and speed and depth and everything, it's not going to just happen. It's not, we actually have to do something about it. And that calls for free will, consciousness, and responsibility, or the ability to respond. And even though if you look in the literature, there's no agreed upon definition of what consciousness is, where it is, or what it has, but it's, like many people would just say that this is the essential building block of how we are connected. And, just going back to the climate science, we talk about like the atmosphere, the biosphere, the cryosphere, and the hydrosphere, et cetera, but we don't pay much attention to the noosphere. And the noosphere is the sphere of human consciousness and shared mental activity, especially regarding its influence on the biosphere. So in terms of if we want to consciously change, we actually have to put this idea of consciousness. And when we think about in terms of systems change, that part of the system is actually becoming self-aware or conscious that we are transforming the system, then that means that the whole system is actually changing. And entanglement consciousness, that leads us to this question of agency. And again, change isn't going to just happen through thinking or wishing for it to happen. And we actually have to start to think about the actions and interventions that will challenge the outdated systems by generating new ones that are equitable and inclusive and sustainable. And so Karen Barad's work on agential realism, where she looks at our intra-actions and that every action we take is actually reconfiguring the system, reconfiguring the world, and we are mattering in the moment. But as we heard this morning, it's not just agency that matters, it's also the quality of agency that matters. Because agency has actually gotten us into a lot of problems. It's created much of the things that we're struggling with here. It can be destructive, it can be oppressive, and it very much is. So I think we need to be focused on a quality of agency that actually recognizes wholeness and expresses what really matters at all scales. And, whether it's equity, diversity, compassion, love, all of those things that applies to every scale. And I'll come to that in a minute. But our agency really does come with a responsibility in that political sphere to shift the norms, rules, standards, regulations, and all of that, and including the power relations in a way that actually benefits all, including future generations. So, this is when it comes to quantum social change, we start to see that individual agency, collective agency, political agency, all of these are really make a difference in, how I show up, what I shift, and what happens. And when we actually apply this quality of agency in everything that we do, we start to have a different approach to scaling change. And this is what I refer to as the fractal approach to scaling change. And fractals matter, because they are these self-similar patterns that repeat themselves at every scale. And we can create them through algebra and geometry. And we often see them in nature. And I think this is one of my favorite drawings of Tonis. It's so the detail of it. But we can also metaphorically create these social fractals, and people are working on fractal politics and urban fractals and things, but we can actually have our actions representing qualities and values that apply to the whole system. And so if we think about ourselves as being these fractals of change that are very context specific, but repeat these patterns that align and connect with all the other patterns, and I'll illustrate this in a moment. But the gist of this, of quantum social change, is that you matter much more than you think. In fact, as part of an entangled quantum system, how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the environment and the future really is about mattering in the moment. And if we think of agency as an entangled, interacting phenomena, then even if we're not aware of it, then we also recognize that we have the capacity to change. And I think that is the potential lies not just in those technologies in the practical sphere, but really in what we do, how we do it. And when it gets going back to the leverage points, it starts to mean that you and I are the leverage points for systems change, because these technologies don't come from nowhere. It really is about how we are together. So from the perspective of quantum social change, all of us, you, me, we are the most powerful solutions to climate change and sustainability issues. And I know I'm running out of time, but I just want to go through what a fractal approach looks like if we actually show up fully in this integrative perspective. We can start to see that we can actually activate fractal agency, identifying the values, identifying what needs to shift, and actually planning and taking those actions. And when we do that, we start to see whether in my project or your project or all the different projects, they can be very specific. We can all be working on different things, but if they are aligned with this quality of agency, with this care for the whole, then we start to see that changes actually happen at multiple scales at multiple times. And to me, this is very like positive to know that we stop going from global to local and top down and bottom up, and we start to see that we are constantly working across scales. And this is from the book, but draws on the Powers of 10 framework from Abbott Bomick and Mark McCaffrey and colleagues. And it really just shows, the individual to the family, to the personal networks, to the community, all the way up to the global, and even to all Homo sapiens who have ever lived. We are part of this larger whole. And I think that gives us a lot more power and a lot more like possibility and potential to actually make these differences. And so in conclusion, just to think about like stepping outside of the paradigms that we were raised in and that are constantly being repeated to us, and thinking about, going out of our comfort zones, recognizing that, it doesn't take 50 years or generations to actually shift paradigms. It can actually happen in the moment when we occupy a different paradigm, when we portray that. And that really is about, making our imprint on the world in a very different way. And so just to end, I think that is the fingerprint we want to make is actually going to happen, like what mattering in the moment and what we do now, making a difference. And so for me, it's, I think that, the biggest challenge we have right now is really to get people to see not just that it's like what we do, but how we do it that matters, and to recognize that all of us matter in every moment.